So today, in research methods, we're going to be dealing with ethics. Ethics is a really important part of psychology because one of the last things that we want to do as psychologists is hurt people. I'm sure that most of us got involved in the field of psychology because we wanted to do good in the world. We wanted to help people. And so understanding ethics is one of the first things that we really need to focus on in order to prevent anything bad happening to the people that we study. And so, therefore, it's going to be a very important topic to discuss. Now, a lot of research in psychology is done on both human and non human research participants. Now, I don't mean robots when I say non human, I mean animal. But there are sets of guidelines for being ethical in your research that are slightly different for dealing with humans, of course, than dealing with animals. But it ends up being really important to make sure that you're not hurting people that are in your study. And it's important too because sometimes you think you're not hurting people and you might be. So it's really important to have this conversation. Now, a lot of research is done on humans is absolutely benign, harmless, and just incredibly boring. For instance, in research I do in my laboratory, I have people remember lines that vary in length. So they sit in front of a computer, and for half an hour, they see line after line whose length they have to reproduce. Now, that I can't think of a more boring thing that I have people do. And boredom is a harmful thing to submit someone to boredom. But in general, research like that isn't harmful, okay? And people get their credit, they move on, and I don't think that anyone has been negatively impacted by a study like that. But not every study is that way. There are certain things that people may be interested in that really could bring back very bad memories, that could make people feel uncomfortable, that could really upset them. And so, whereas it's only a very small segment of research that where there's a potential for there being ethical implications, because the impact can be so severe, it's important to really discuss this and focus on the idea of being an ethical researcher. And then there's an associated aspect that's worth mentioning, which is being an honest and ethical researcher. Now, there have been, in the last couple of years, revelations that there have been several psychologists who have engaged in outright fraud. We're going to talk about one of the most important ones of these, a man named Dietrich Stapel from the Netherlands, who fabricated up to 55 papers. And it really was an event when people found out that he fabricated this work. It really affected a lot of people because he was a very important person in the field of social psychology. And we're going to talk about fraud and being honest because it's part of being an ethical researcher. And so that's going to be something that we're going to focus on towards the end of this discussion. Now, one of the bigger organizations that governs psychologists is called the American Psychological Association. It's the largest association in the United States of psychologists. And although most of its members are clinical psychologists, by which I mean people who deal with people who have mental illness and who need counseling, most psychologists who don't do that kind of work, that do research, still ascribe to the American Psychological Association's guidelines for ethical research. And so there are these following components that we'll talk about that are important for being an ethical researcher. One is research responsibility, another is protecting participants from harm, another is institutional review, another is informed consent, privacy, and freedom from coercion, and finally, responsible deception and debriefing. And we'll talk about each of these in turn. So, research responsibility. Psychology is a very broad field, and people who are psychologists end up doing any of a number of things in any of a number of businesses, government, educational settings. And one of the important things that psychologists must do is to only practice psychology within the field in which they were trained. So, for instance, I myself was trained in research psychology. I'm an experimental psychologist. I run experiments. I have actually never taken a class on abnormal psychology. I've never taken a class on therapy or clinical psychology. So it would be wrong for me to go out there and, hang up a sign outside of my, house and say, I'm a psychologist. I'm ready and willing to give advice, in terms of helping people with mental issues. Not allowed to do that because it's not what my training is in. So it's very important that if you're a psychologist that you need to only work in an area that you're trained in. And if you want to work in a different area, for instance, if I wanted to start doing clinical work, I would have to get the training that's involved in being able to do that. And that involves taking other classes, that involves having supervision from someone who's an established clinician. But it would only be after I would do that I would be able to provide those services as a psychologist. So it's very important to know that just because you're a psychologist doesn't mean that you're able to go out there and help people with their mental issues. There are many different kinds of psychologists, and not all of them are the kind that help people. Now, protecting people from harm is really important. So when a person is in a research study, you want to protect them from any possible harm that they could experience. Why? Because if people started getting harmed from being in research studies, very quickly you would find people unwilling to volunteer to be in studies. And when people would do that, we would have no data on which we could make any kinds of claims. So we try to put people in as little harm as possible that are part of our experiments. And the way in which we define that is, do the experiment that some person is doing, or the study that a person's doing, does it put them in an excess of risk that they would experience in daily life? Okay, so for instance, if you do studies like I do in my lab, where I bring people in, sit them in front of a computer, and have them do a variety of tasks like reproduce the length of lines, they are doing something that would be very much like what they would do if they were going to the library to work on a computer, or if they were at home working on their computer. There's nothing in that situation that would put them in great risk. Now, one could always say that what happens if there's an earthquake and the ceiling falls in? Yes, that's a possibility, but that's the kind of risk that people have in daily life anyway. So long as we're not increasing the risk, then that we can do this kind of study. Now, again, most psychologists do work that's very benign, but there are other psychologists that do things that could put people at risk. For instance, I used to know someone that would do studies in which they would give people enormous amounts of alcohol, and they would study sleep during intoxication. Now, in the morning after the person was done the study, they couldn't just let the person walk out onto the street and, being all hungover and everything. They could get into an accident, or they could still be drunk, or they could still be incapacitated in a certain way. So part of the research protocol was that every subject that was in this study was given a taxi cab that brought them home, and the study paid for the taxi cab, so that there would be no risk that the person would either harm themselves or harm someone else. And that's what we do in protecting people from harm. It's very rare, though, that people do studies like that. And if there is any risk of harm that exceeds that which is experienced in daily life, it needs to be explained to participants before their participation. Next, there's institutional review. Now, before you do any study, a researcher has to apply for and receive permission from a board that's set up at every university called an institutional review board. It's often abbreviated IRB. And the IRB consists of scholars, who are other psychologists, ethicists, community members, and these people review research protocols to determine whether the project is ethically acceptable. Okay, so they decide whether the harm is minimal or whether are all the risks outlined to the participant prior to the beginning of the study. So when I do a study, no matter how benign it might be, I have to type up this report. It's rather long. It's about 20 pages of questions that you have to answer. And I have to provide a protocol of what I'm going to do. I have to describe the background research to justify why I'm doing this. And the purpose for this is so that this board can review what we do and before we start and can determine that this is a project that can go forward. It is an important step. And because there are people out there that are doing research that they don't realize how harmful the research could be. One time I was on an institutional review board where someone wanted to do a project in which they were going to be interviewing sex workers in a foreign country. And, it seemed as if there was no protocol for hiding the identity, to assuring anonymity. And if someone found out, a family member or, one of the sex traffickers, that this person spoke to a researcher, it was not inconceivable that this sex worker could end up in a ditch or in a shallow grave because of the fact that the perception that might incur from having talked to a researcher. So even studies where someone thinks that they're not doing anything that's potentially harmful, there's always room for harm to occur. It's almost like Murphy's Law, that if something bad is going to happen, it will. Same thing in research. You have to be prepared. And having an institutional review board is a really good way to prepare. Now, there is some talk in recent years of eliminating institutional review for many classes of psychological studies. For instance, for cognitive studies in which there's no ethical possible violations, we might be able to do a more quick review than the traditional one. And it's only more controversial projects that will go under full review. But we'll see how that changes over the course of the next 5 years. But it's a new development that I just wanted to mention. Next, before you run a study, all people who are participants have to be informed of the risks and benefits of their participation. And we do this by giving people a consent form. Okay, it's usually a piece of paper, although sometimes with computer-based projects it's just a web page. And it outlines the risks, if there are any, and benefits, such as payments, educational benefits, of participating in a study. Okay, so if it's the case that a risk could be that a person might be upset about the questions that are asked, that must be discussed in the informed consent. And at the end, participants have to sign the form stating that they understand the risks or benefits. Or if it's on computer, they have to click a box saying that I understand the risks and benefits. Now, this is all true for people that are above the age of 18, but if you're younger than 18, if you're a child, or if you're mentally incapacitated, you need to have a guardian that will have to sign for the participant. So for children, often it's the case that there's a two-step process. You have to ask parents for their permission, and then you have to ask the children for their assent, which is their agreement that they will participate in the study. And that's how you get children to be involved in these studies. Next, it's important that all research findings be kept confidential, by which I mean that one's name and the data that's collected must always be separate and can never be identified. So for instance, on the consent form that I set participants sign, I can't put a subject number and then go onto the data that's produced from the study and put that same subject number. Because what that would do is allow someone to make the connection between a person's identity and their data. Instead, the consent form must be signed and kept in a separate location, often in a separate file cabinet than the actual data, so that there's no chance that one could figure out who each subject was in the study. So typically you do things like you use random subject numbers, and that's, protects people's identity. It's very important, because some studies ask people pretty personal information. If someone does research on sexuality, it may really affect someone's employment if they admit to, some, sexual orientation that is not protected by the law, or, that might prejudice them. There are many things that you can imagine asking people that they don't want out there. Everyone has a private life and private facts, and even though there are researchers that probe these things, it's not the case that everyone wants to have that out in the open. So that's an important thing, to keep people's identity private. Also, participation in a research study must be voluntary and not coerced. You can't force people to be in a study. And in fact, if someone comes to a study, signs the consent form, and says, "Now I want to leave," you have to let them leave. And you have to do so without any penalty. So if you said that you were going to pay them $10 for an hour of their time, you have to pay them that $10, even if they don't even do the study. That's just the nature of the way in which the federal law is set up. And so if a person withdraws from the study after signing the consent form, they can't be penalized for doing that. You cannot force people to be in your study. Finally, there's a class of studies that use deception. And deception is when the true nature of a study is not revealed to participants before they participate. Okay, so you might do a study in which you say that it's about memory, but in reality, it's about whether or not the subject is interacting with another person who's either male or female. Okay, well, the idea that you're really testing is performance when the other partner that you're interacting with is a male or female. You're not really interested in the memory part. And so deception is that kind of, when you don't reveal the true nature of the study. I would just want to mention one thing, is that psychologists tend to like to use deception. People in other fields do not. Economists, for instance, hate the idea of using deception. So if you ever are doing work with an economist, don't ever suggest doing a deception study, because they will get very angry at you. But if you ever do use deception, you have to, at the end of the study, tell participants how they were deceived. So if the real nature of the study was about the gender of the person that the subject interacted with, you have to tell them that at the end of the study. And finally, all participants should receive information about the nature of the study in which they participated, and be directed to further information about the study if requested. Not every researcher follows this to the letter of the law, but technically, when people are in experiments, they're supposed to get a copy at the end of the general results. Now, again, most people don't ask for it. We always offer it to people that if they want to have a copy of the paper at the end of once it's published, they can get it. I've never had anyone ever actually want a copy, but it's good to offer it to them. So all of this, what I just spoke about, all of this ethics, this is all governed by federal law. Okay, so the federal government says that all institutions that get federal funding, which basically means everyone, they must have an IRB that approves research. And if it's the case that an institution, violates any of these rules, for instance, does not follow the rule of having to have people sign consent forms, the university will have suspension of all its federal funding. Now, you might not quite understand how severe that would be, but in reality, about 40% of most universities are supported by federal funding. And so it would paralyze an institution if they had their federal funding withdrawn. It actually happened about 10 years ago at the University of Illinois Chicago. It found out that some researcher wasn't doing their research in a way that was ethical, and the federal government suspended funding for 3 weeks, which made the university lose many millions of dollars in research funds. I wouldn't have wanted to be that guy because I don't think that he had a job for long after that. So it's very important to follow these laws very carefully because they really do govern the way in which you must behave when you interact with human participants. Now, there are a couple of exceptions to these laws where you don't need to apply for an IRB, you don't need to get consent, and these are situations like this. Imagine that you go to a park or a mall and you observe interactions of children, but you're not interacting with them. You're not asking them questions or recording their names. You're just doing something like determining whether or not boys are, more likely to speak than girls, or girls are more likely to speak than boys. Then you don't need to do any of the IRB or anything like that because you're not interacting with them. So they don't even know that you're doing research. Certain kinds of educational testing that occurs as part of normal school. So if you're interested in interventions such as putting slides up online, does that improve people's learning? Then that's part of what happens in normal schools, so you don't need to do an IRB for that. Class projects that pose minimal risk that won't be published, that's one class that typically gets accepted that you don't need to have IRB. And also some pilot studies. So imagine that you have a couple of friends that are willing to participate in a study at the initial phases just to see if you want to, if this project's going to work. Then, generally speaking, such studies can be done without getting IRB approval. It's only those studies that you aim to publish where identifying a person could influence them and their life history that it becomes very important to follow these ethical laws. But in general, it's good to follow. These are good guidelines to begin with because they provide sort of a good framework for reminding us that, first do no harm, which is one of the most important rules that we can have when we're doing research. So, finally, there are some frequently asked questions. Can research results be subpoenaed? And the answer to that is yes. Researchers do not have therapist or client-lawyer privilege. However, this is exceedingly rare. I've never heard of it happening in order to gain information about a subject. It's usually done to audit a researcher. Okay, so if there's suspicion that a researcher stole money, their files can be audited to make sure that people actually were studied. But that's not done as a way to get information about participants. Do participants have a right to know their own results? So imagine I run people on a test. Does the participant, do they have a right to see their performance? And the answer is no. The participants have a right to see the result of the study as a whole, but the individual data is the property of the researcher. And there's a lot of reasons why you don't want to give people their results. It can be misinterpreted. People don't quite understand that most of the time when we do studies, we're not looking at the behavior of individuals. We're looking at large groups. We're looking at the group of people that took a particular drug versus a placebo. We're not looking at person N. So that's why we don't tend to give out data to people. Now, there's a couple of classic cases of ethics violation in experiments that are worthy of mentioning. The first one's so famous that it doesn't really require much discussion. Milgram's 1968 obedience study. We all know this study as a person comes to the lab and they're assigned as a teacher. And they have to teach a student who needs to remember a certain list of numbers. And what happens is the student actually is not another volunteer. The student works for the experimenter. And what the student does is, they are apparently shocked with electricity by the teacher in increasing amounts. And if you look on the right of your screen, that's the actual machine that Milgram used at Yale University when he did this study back in the 1960s. And of course, the machine itself was not hooked up to any electricity whatsoever. It was just a bunch of buttons that he put together on one of these panels. But the teacher didn't know that. The teacher thought that he was actually shocking the student. And it gets to a certain point where it gets so bad that the student starts screaming, "Stop, stop, stop, shocking me." And the experimenter keeps on telling the teacher, "You must go on, you must go on." And there's a certain point on that machine that you see there where it says lethal dose. And the question is, what proportion of people give a lethal dose to the student? And the answer, and they did many variations for this study, is about 60%. 60 to 80% of people will administer a lethal shock because the experimenter told them to do so. Now, there's a lot of interpretations as to why this study happened the way in which it did, and it has a long history. But it's an important one because a lot of the people who were participants, were really shooken up after they participated in this study. And so the question is whether or not this was one that today's standards would be allowed. And there are some people that have replicated this study and others who haven't. But, the problem with this study is that it's so famous now that everyone knows about it. So it's kind of hard to replicate. A second example is the Stanford prison experiment, in which a Stanford professor, Phil Zimbardo, randomly assigned a group of college students to be either prisoners or prison guards. And he famously had to end the experiment within a couple of days because the prison guards, who again are just Stanford students, began to be excessively harsh on the prisoners, to the point that he was afraid that the prisoners would have mental problems because of their abuse that they were experiencing. It is controversial because there's a lot of examples in history of similar kinds of things occurring. The most famous one being the Abu Ghraib prison in Iraq, in which army people who worked for the military police abused Iraqi prisoners in the Iraq War in the 2000s. And, they did this photographic documentation of what they did. They were very abusive. They would do similar kinds of things. And you would wonder, why are these well-trained people being so abusive? And the idea being that certain contexts just make people be bad. So the idea being that, sometimes it's not one apple that spoils the bunch, but the barrel that spoils all the apples inside. It's a controversial study, but it's one that has an enormous role. Everyone learns about it in intro psych, but it's one worth remembering. Finally, there's another one of, more recently, a Northwestern psychologist, J. Michael Bailey, who did research in which he studied people who were transgender. And in this book that he wrote, he didn't do a good job hiding the identity of the women that were interviewed. And it ended up that some of the women were actually beat up because it was very easy for people to identify both the bar and the people in the book because he took no effort to hide their identity. This came out maybe 15 years ago, and I think that societal opinions about transgender are in great flux. I think that 15 years ago it was much more controversial than it is today, but that's just another example.